Okay, I think we'll get started. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anne-Sophie Stevens. I'm Senior Science Officer at the International Science Council, and welcome to this session on enhancing governance for sustainability. So over the next 30 minutes, we'll introduce the thematic report on governance for sustainability that we've worked on with the IASA and ISC colleagues and a number of experts from different partner organizations. We'll introduce the report and we'll have a Q&A session in the second part of this session. So the main question for us has really been what lessons can we learn from the COVID-19 crisis in terms of governance for sustainability? And for us, the COVID-19 health and socioeconomic crisis raised the question of how do we manage compound and systemic risk. So how do we how our governance arrangements, our economies, our societies deal with shocks, with multiple stresses, and also how do we manage interdependencies when we've seen a local biological threat quickly escalate into a global health and socioeconomic crisis with very differentiated impacts across countries and cascading impacts. So as we in this initiative turn to the recovery discussion, it's really the opportunity to look at what directions we want to take going forward in terms of where investments and public and private priorities should be directed at. And it's really bringing the questions of equity, sustainability, resilience together as one agenda. So we'll hear from my two co-leads, Reinhard Meckler, who leads the Systemic Risk and Resilience Group at IASA, and Teresa de Burley, who is researcher at Systemic Risk and Resilience Group at IASA as well. And then we'll have a Q&A discussion. So a few housekeeping information before I hand over to Reinhard. You're currently in the listening mode, so you see at the top right, near the eye icon, we have 19 people in the session. When you want to, if you want to raise a question or make a comment in the Q&A discussion, you'll need to click on the blue share audio and video so that you can come up and raise a point. And feel free also, as some of you have already started doing, using the chat on the right-hand side of your screen. And the session is recorded and it will be available in the expo area after the session closed. With that, I hand over to Teresa, first of all, I think. Teresa, over to
Thank
you.
you, Anne-Sophie. Thank you, Anne-Sophie. Welcome also from my side. Really nice to be able to speak to you today and to share a little bit about the work we've done in the initiative between IASA and ISC, and plenty of partners that have joined us in the consultations, and also the findings that we have put forward in our report building on this initiative. So as you see on the slide, it describes a little bit how our initiative works. It's really been a combined effort between the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis and the ISC, the International Science Council, and we really worked together and made sure that we draw on our unique skill sets, experiences, and also networks. And in doing that, we were able to really put together a global hub for scientists, for researchers, but also representatives from NGO, from government, policymakers, came together and discussed on 4 themes. We have the governance for sustainability theme that we're sharing lessons about today, right now, but also strengthening science systems, resilient food systems, and sustainable energy as a theme, which we really identified as the core themes that are shaped by the crisis that is ongoing. And this crisis it has plenty of impacts, but at the end of the day, how it's managed is really also a question of governance. It's a question of those decision-making mechanisms and networks in which the decision-making process takes place. It's a question of coordination, not just between national governments or subnational governments, but really also at this global level. And so, as you can see on this slide here, we really have this, it's a governance question. And it's a governance question of how to move from this crisis towards sustainability transformations. And one of the questions that we asked ourselves is also, can this crisis in a positive spin, be a jumping board for really helping us shift more towards sustainable futures. And if that is the premise of it, what are the governance mechanisms needed to move in this direction? And so the process of our initiative has really been one where we started with a literature review. We looked at already what's been done and researched about the crisis as it emerges, what is the literature also, the governance mechanisms, and then went into 3 really intensive consultations where we tried to get as much input as possible from these different stakeholder groups. And we had the first consultation really dedicated to science and research input. The second one was focused more on bringing in the insights from the private sector also, but also from NGOs. And in the third one, we then tried to distill those first emerging learnings and test them and advance them also with policy and decision makers. And so with that, we were able to come up with a set of options and recommendations, which we then brought to our advisory board, where we have a group of really senior and very experienced decision makers come together and sound out those options that we identified. And as a last step in this process, we synthesized them and put them together in the report, which you can scroll down and you can actually see it, find it under the main presentation area and link to it. So please do so. In our process, in the initiative, we focused on, especially in our theme, on identifying these pathways, and where on these pathways towards a more sustainable future decision-making takes place. And so you can see on the slide, it's not easy, it's not simple, it's a complex, sometimes wicked thing to understand where decision-making takes place and how to improve that decision-making in governance arrangements. And we try to use this pathways approach to identify these opportunities. And so I'll hand over to Deinhard now, who will explain a little bit more about the method side of the approach, but then also share with you our findings, which I think you're all excited to hear about. Right, maybe just before I do that.
Good morning, good afternoon. Yeah. Right.
No, just, yeah.
Good to be in touch with many of you. Thanks, Teresa and Anne-Sophie. Yasa and I see on the business of like supporting sustainability transitions and transformations. I'm sure many of you, and good to see many colleagues, many of you are in the same business. We know the greener and the more inclusive, the more resilient world has been proceeding pre-COVID, but the pace has not been up to what's needed. So can the learnings from COVID help us to push forward with those transformations? Here you see a few photos, what's happening in terms of like climate mitigation, climate adaptation, something we work on. So that's this question about decision points and taking options forward. The question we pose to ourselves, what are policy options that can help us to go ahead with sustainability transformations? We went through those 3 exercises as alluded to by Teresa. And the last one, we went into a more concrete exercise that went into the pathways, which also you'll find in the title of this initiative. So we try to think about what's the feasibility of implementing further options, what are enablers, what are entry points for some of the policy options we distilled from the literature and we discussed in the 2 prior consultations. Our focus has been a bit more short to medium term, next 10 years, because that's the sustainability development goals ambition period. Finally, as you can see in our report, we aimed at prioritizing key options that ended up on a short list, mostly with regard to global governance, how to think about global cooperation, international institutions, but also national governments joining international conventions. And then the question about national governance, how to governance and cooperation with regard to risk and resilience in national systems. So emphasize the national systems. It's not about national governments only, but it's also about local government, civil society organizations, the private sector. We try to build on present concerns to push forward with pathway that can lead us into that complex SDG space where we are all working in to make those, how is it, 19, right? SDGs, make those happen. 17 SDGs, sorry. Guiding question for this last exercise has been what is necessary, what is doable, and what is needed to make it happen. Finally, we distilled a few options that currently are still a bit abstract, but we try to make those happen. And that's why we are also gathered to discuss with you further what to do about global governance, national to local systems governance. And then we connected it also to this issue about multi-level governance. Let me shortly just present you a little bit like insight or learnings with regard to the areas. So global governance, it's about reforming and repurposing global institutions to enhance global governance in an ever riskier world. That discussion has been going on because our global institutions have been crafted in the aftermath of World War II. There's lots of discussion about reforming, etc. It's easy to talk, but the question is what's needed. Our learning is that today's global challenges, COVID and climate change, don't come as a surprise, and they are also characterized by interconnectedness. So how can the international system that's a bit building on specialized agency, how can that better cooperate and better respond to those interrelated systemic challenges? So how to shift towards more integrated processes? Can science, policies, society interfaces provide evidence-based and targeted and participatory information? A key issue is the accountability and transparency in these governance arrangements. Yeah, for example, data sharing, a big issue that needs attention also during the COVID crisis. In red, you see what we identified a little bit as like a concrete action-oriented item here, where we are suggesting that there needs to be more cooperation, mission-oriented ways. For example, we got the EU Sustainability Recovery Alliance, we got the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, discussions that are strongly going into the implementation, supporting of implementation direction. How can COVID be a springboard to think about risk and resilience, for example, and to support countries in the global south, for example, in their challenges? So that only that you see the level that we're operating at. It's a bit high level, but it provides space for further discussions. At the multi-level governance is about understanding, accounting, managing externalities and risks across these scales. So shared understanding, experience from dealing with risk at individual and community levels is important. As we speak here, we also got the Davos Forum, the World Economic Forum happening. They got a global risk report that is looking into high-powered decision makers at the global level. What you see in red identified by us is to suggest to complement this effort, to think about a multi-level global risk and resilience dialogue that works more bottom-up, to look into those places that are uncharted or unmapped and report, for example, from like smallholder farmers in India or like in Nepal or some other places that are having a hard time dealing with COVID and other risks. Can we not also report from those uncharted places? Can we bring that in? So that has been a suggestion, and somehow we are also proceeding with that at the ISC and the EASA. Other suggestions have been alignment of investments into the SDGs, and like aligning this also with the packages that help to recover from COVID. We got a related financial. Think about an SDG disclosure mechanism. So can we beef it up and make it more broad-based? And then some other suggestion. Let me just come to the last issue here. So the last high-level policy field and option that we identified, that's to think about governance in national systems. Here we're suggesting to make systemic resilience and sustainability a core government priority. It's not about looking into disasters, climate change, COVID separately. How can we integrate it and enhance ownership and transparency in dealing with that? To tackle vulnerability and resilience and create multiple dividends. So health systems help with COVID. They also help with, like in a warming climate, help with supporting elder population segments with dealing with heat waves. Right, here are some suggestions in red. Just let me identify in red. The obvious thing, can COVID recovery packages be integrated to look into, to also support investments into SDGs and SDG-wide resilience? It's the ambition in the EU and the ambition in other places, and we think what's needed here is also like a tracking mechanism, a kind tracking mechanism and a dialogue to support that these recovery packages are aligned with this long-term trajectory that should get us into the SDG transformations. So that's what I wanted to show to you. What you're seeing, we're to bring it down to ground. We got those reports online. I hope this provides a basis for further discussions with you. We are deepening the analytical basis now. We're thinking about pathways, and we hope to engage with you and others further on, and to build a multi-stakeholder platform and to really go into more the implementation mode. So that's a bit the ambition now for 2021 and beyond, and I wanted to leave it at that, and I hope we can have further discussions here online. Back to Anne-Sophie.
Thank you, Reinhard and Teresa. Thank you very much. And the discussion has already started in the chat. So just a reminder, if you would like to come forward to make a comment or ask a question, you need to click the share audio and video blue button at the top of the screen. Can I ask if T. Gup that left a question in the comment would like to make the comment live? Would you like the floor? I can otherwise ask the question, which relates to the point about the monetary and financial system, which seem to have not been covered extensively in the initiative, while it seems very important to take into account. Would you like, Reinhard, to take that one, because you mentioned some of the discussion we had around the TCFD as part of the governance track.
That's a good point. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Thank you also for the comment raised. I think it has been a cross-cutting item for all of our 4 consultations. So energy, science, and food. Certainly finance is key. I mentioned the enablers beforehand. So barriers, enablers, and of course finance can be an enabler, can be a barrier. We touched on that. We didn't go endlessly in depth, right? So more to be done. However, as alluded to in my first or second last slide, we wanted to really also respond to this basically tracing climate risks that are sitting in governments or central bank balance sheets. So that's been here to put all these risks into the balance sheets and see how can this turn around central banks and their actions. Just yesterday, the European Central Bank is setting up a department, a climate unit, a climate analytical unit. It will take such thinking forward. So there's quite some action here. We think it could be beefed up a little bit to go beyond climate risks only into compound or systemic risk. Compound meaning climate risk, COVID, covariates, so that are affecting many, and individual risks that are affecting a few only. So that could be better looked at. So that's something we suggest should take forward. Systemic means there's this chance for collapse. And that's why the central bank, of course, is now starting to look into that 10 years after the financial crisis. So I think I would agree, we haven't gone into endless depth here, and we would certainly, with all of you and the person putting that comment in, but I think we can do more in the second phase, and finance will always come in. But we don't want to stick to finance and economics only, because the crisis has shown it's much more, right? How do we define finance, economic cooperation? That's up to us. So it's much bigger, I think, and we also would like to go into that direction. Thanks.
Thank you. I don't see other questions from participants at this stage, so I'll share one around the idea of the sort of data and information that needs to support that governance for systemic risk, because what gets measured gets taken into account in decision making. And what are your thoughts on what needs to be changed about how risk is assessed to better inform decision making in the way that really go in the right directions for taking into account systemic risk and resilience? What risk information are we actually needing to better govern risk?
Yeah. Teresa, should I, or you want to go ahead?
Well, I think we started. I think what's important is especially how it's communicated. It's so that it's understandable, because those making the decisions are not necessarily folks that are very familiar with the methodology and the approach that's taken in assessing risks. They care about the messages and how to shape measures, shape approaches and policies in line with those risks. And so it's about risk communication at the end of the day, especially when you come into the governance side of things. Decision makers need to understand what the risks are and what the implications of those risks would be, and they need to have that information at the right time. So that's really just to underline the importance of really communicating very clearly along this science and decision-making interface, which is very much at the forefront of this. But maybe Reinhard, if you want to add a little bit on the methodological side, please feel free to.
2 points to add, as what we also see in the COVID crisis. There's ways to objectivize risk, to come up with like objective risk information, which is actionable, and that's very important. But then people have their perceptions, and we see perceptions go into interesting directions. And of course, each and everyone can have his or her perception, that's fine. But I think to like go forward with an evidence-based approach to that, it's probably important to engage in a dialogue. Explain a bit more like how does perception align needed, or how can we make more objective risk, obviously, as risk is a construct. I think we need a dialogue, and COVID is showing that it's quite complicated, right? To think about the risk from vaccinations, the risk from the disease, and how is that with climate change going forward, as an example, going forward another 30 years, 40 years. So I think more focused and targeted communication exercises are needed, and investing into that. I personally work with the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. It has invested quite a bit into graphics designer. They're putting up nice visuals, but also like interactions with government types, but also like civil society, certainly going to local levels. I think that's important. Also, what we're missing from the risk dialogue, we are missing quite a few data points. As we also know, IIASA is a model-heavy place. We are modeling risk, and of course, we can only model what Anne-Sophie alluded to, that has been measured. A lot of things are not getting measured. So intangible impacts on people's well-being, issue of like place, culture, like belonging to places. So we are lacking that for many places in the world, and particularly for places that are heavily being impacted. And that holds true for COVID, but also the climate crisis and other crises. So I think more is needed here to also map out those places where risks are more prevalent, where more action needs to be taken. So that's why we put this risk dialogue, this global risk dialogue. Certainly, that's an ambitious suggestion, but that's why we put it down, and we hope to further take this forward. Thank you for that point, Anne-Sophie. Of course, you're also a partner in this effort. Yeah.
Thank you. Perhaps one last question, if there's no one from the audience that want to come forward. As you suggested, it's been very much the value is in the process always around these things, more than the product itself. And I think it's been quite important to see how we actually bringing the risks, the governance, the sustainability science together in a process like this. And I just wonder what are your reflections about what we've done to date, and what you would like to see happen going forward in terms of really bridging the different science fields that are needed to address that question that we've posed effectively. Do you want to reflect on our process to date?
Yeah, I could quickly do that. So we kept mentioning it's IIASA ISC, but actually that's not fully true, right? We used we work with quite a few colleagues globally across continents, and so people were quite willing to put in their time and discuss with you during those consultations and as we proceed the final report. So I think we somehow managed to build a little like a platform already. So that's science, but that's also policy, private sector, and civil society. So we managed to build a platform here that it will be nice to further proceed. What's interesting, I think we engage global governance. So there is, of course, as we know in science, there's also fragmentation, but we managed to link up to research, policy, and practice. and we aligned this somehow with the risk and resilience, colleagues working on risk and resilience. So I think that's quite fruitful. That's quite a fruitful exercise. Of course, we are going in the same direction of travel, but these are different debates and dialogues. I thought they are somewhat coming together around this question about crises, which is of course a negative term, right? But this seems to be accepted. Climate crisis, COVID crisis. How can we turn this into something useful that can help with this global reform that is ongoing with UN? And how can here the governance and the risk and resilience dialogue into in order to help with better cooperation at global to national levels? I think we have proceeded to a certain way, but now it would be, the next step would be to make it more concrete. Make it more concrete, take one or two of these maybe identified in red, take one of 2 or 3 of these options, and see about proceeding with that. Certainly my favorite is this risk dialogue. I would like to see that going forward.
Thank you. And as you've said, we're already taking some steps in that direction as well. So thank you very much. Teresa, do you want to add anything? And then we'll close the session.
I think actually I would second that risk dialogue, and I'm happy to see so many join us in the session today, because even events like that, they may be small, but they are an opportunity for us to really bring those messages out and move into the direction that we're aiming to go to with the initiative and with our suggestions such as a dialogue.